The galaxy had known peace for 300 years, and nobody expected that peace to end on a quiet morning in the Valoran Sector Senior Officer Krath of the Crimson Empire sat at his monitoring station and watched the same empty stretch of space. He had watched for the last 15 years of his career, and he expected nothing to change because nothing ever changed in this forgotten corner of the universe. The dead corridor stretched before him on his screens like a wound in the fabric of space itself, and it was a region that had claimed every ship foolish enough to enter it for the last 10,000 years, and the ancient records spoke of gravitational anomalies and radiation storms and spatial tears that could rip a vessel apart in seconds, and no probe had ever returned from its depths, and no signal had ever emerged from its darkness. Krath yawned and reached for his morning drink, and then his console began to scream. Every alarm in the station activated at once, and red lights flooded the room, and Krath spilled his drink across his uniform as he scrambled to understand what was happening, and his fingers flew across the controls, and his eyes went wide with disbelief. Something was coming out of the dead corridor. He checked his instruments 3 times because they had to be wrong, and nothing came out of the dead corridor, and nothing could survive in that hellish stretch of twisted space. And yet his sensors showed a clear reading, and a single vessel was emerging from the impossible darkness. Krath sent an emergency transmission to Crimson Command, and his voice shook as he reported what he was seeing, and within minutes, his small station was flooded with communication requests from admirals and intelligence officers and government officials who all demanded to know if this was some kind of joke. It was not a joke. The vessel cleared the boundary of the dead corridor and entered normal space, and Krath got his first clear look at it, and his blood ran cold in his veins. The ship was small by Imperial standards, and it measured barely a kilometer from bow to stern, and the great warships of the Crimson Empire stretched for dozens of kilometers and could carry populations of small cities. And yet, something about this vessel made Krath feel afraid in a way he could not explain. It moved wrong, and that was the only way he could describe it, and the drive signature matched nothing in any database he could access, and the ship seemed to glide through space with an efficiency that violated everything Krath understood about propulsion technology. And it was beautiful in a terrible way, like watching a predator move through water. The vessel broadcast no identification, and it responded to no hails, and it simply moved forward on a course that would take it toward the galactic core and toward the heart of civilization itself. Krath watched as a Crimson patrol ship moved to intercept, and he listened to the communications between the patrol captain and his superiors, and the captain was ordered to approach the unknown vessel and demand identification, and Krath thought that the captain sounded nervous, and he had good reason to. The patrol ship came within scanning range, and its sensors swept across the unknown vessel, and the data that came back made no sense, and the hull was composed of materials that the computer could not identify, and the power readings fluctuated in patterns that seemed almost organic, and there were weapon systems visible on the exterior, but they matched no known design. Patrol captain hailed the vessel again and again and again, and silence was the only response. Then something changed. The unknown vessel began to broadcast, and Krath leaned forward in his seat as his station picked up the signal, and it was not a response to the hails, but rather a simple identification beacon, and it contained a name and a symbol and a language that the translation matrices struggled to process. The computer worked for several long seconds, and then it rendered its best interpretation, and the name of the vessel was Endurance, and the symbol was a blue and green circle that meant nothing to Krath, but would soon mean everything to the galaxy. Language was human. Krath felt his heart stop in his chest, because humans were extinct, and everyone knew that humans were extinct, and the history books said that humans had been wiped out 2,000 years ago, and their world had been burned to ash, and their species had been erased from existence. He pulled up the ancient files with trembling fingers, and he read the old reports, and he learned what his ancestors had done to a young species that had refused to bow, and he understood why. His superiors had sounded so frightened when he first reported the contact. The great cleansing had been thorough, and 17 species had joined together to destroy humanity, and they had burned Earth until its oceans boiled, and they had hunted down every colony and every outpost and every ship that carried human life, and they had declared the species extinct, and they had celebrated their victory. But some humans had escaped into the dead corridor, and everyone had assumed they died there, because everything died in the dead corridor, and nobody had questioned that assumption for 2,000 years now. Krath questioned it. Watched the Endurance move through space with that terrible grace, and he thought about what kind of species could survive in a place that killed everything else, and he thought about what 2,000 years of survival might do to such a species, and he thought about the promise that the old record said the humans had made. They had promised to returnward, spread through the Crimson Empire, like fire through dry grass, and within hours every official and every officer and every citizen who had access to news feeds knew that a human ship had emerged from the dead corridor, and the reactions ranged from disbelief to terror to a strange kind of fascination. The Nova Dominion learned of the arrival shortly after the Crimson Empire did, because spies existed on both sides, and secrets rarely stayed secret for long, and soon both great powers were scrambling to understand what this meant. Emergency sessions were called in Capitol buildings across 100 worlds, and historians were dragged from their quiet studies to explain what had happened 2,000 years ago, and military analysts tried to assess the threat level of a single ship that should not exist. Nobody knew what to do. The Endurance continued on its course, and it did not slow down, and it did not speed up, and it did not respond to any attempt at communication, and it simply moved forward like something inevitable and unstoppable. Kroth watched it until a shift ended, and then he watched it some more because he could not look away, and he felt like he was witnessing history, and he felt like he was witnessing judgment, and he did not know which possibility frightened him more. The humans had returned, and the galaxy would never be the same. In the great halls of the Crimson Empire, and in the gleaming towers of the Nova Dominion, and in 1,000 other places across civilized space, the leaders of the galaxy asked themselves the same questions, and they found no answers, and they felt a fear that they had not known for 300 years. What did the humans want, and what had they become, and what would they do to the species that had tried to destroy them? The Endurance offered no answers, and it simply moved forward through the stars, and it carried with it the weight of 2,000 years of waiting and the promise of a reckoning that had been delayed but never forgotten. Krath finally left his station as his replacement arrived, and he walked to his quarters in a daze, and he lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling, and he thought about the future, and he wondered if he would live to see what came next. Galaxy had known peace for 300 years, and that peace had ended on a quiet morning in the Valoran sector, and nothing would ever be the same. Again, a human warship had arrived, and terror spread through the Crimson and Nova empires like poison in the blood, and the ancient sins of their ancestors had finally come home to roost. The Endurance moved through the darkness of space, and somewhere in its hull, a human crew went about their duties, and they had waited so long for this moment, and they were patient, and they were ready, and they had not forgotten. They had not forgotten anything at all. The archives of the Crimson Empire had not been opened in centuries, and dust covered the ancient storage units, and the lights flickered. When the power was restored to the long-forgotten chambers beneath the capital city high, Archivist Valeth moved through the dark corridors with a team of nervous assistants, and she had been dragged from her comfortable office by a direct order from the Emperor himself, and she had been told to find everything related to the humans, and she had been told that failure was not an option. She found the files in a sealed vault that required 3 separate authentication codes to open, and the vault door groaned as it swung open for the first time in 500 years, and the smell of old data crystals and decaying storage media filled her nostrils. Valve began to read, and what she found made her sick to her stomach. Humans had been discovered 2,300 years ago by a Crimson exploration vessel, and they had been a young species, confined to a single unremarkable star system, and they had just begun to reach out into the cosmos with primitive ships and hopeful hearts. First contact had gone well at first, and the humans had been curious and friendly and eager to learn about the wider galaxy, and they had asked questions about everything, and they had shared their own knowledge freely, and they had seemed like a species that would make good partners in the great work of civilization. But the humans had also been proud, and they had refused to submit to the established order, and they had rejected the demand that they pay tribute to the great powers, and they had insisted on being treated as equals. Even though they were weak and young and alone, the great powers had been offended by this arrogance, and they had given the humans a choice, and they could kneel or they could burn. The humans had chosen to burn. Valith read the accounts of the great cleansing with growing horror, and she learned how 17 species had joined together to punish humanity for its pride, and she learned how the combined fleet had descended upon Earth with weapons that could crack continents and boil oceans. The humans had fought back with everything they had, and their primitive ships had thrown themselves against the overwhelming force with desperate courage, and they had known they could not win, and they had fought anyway, had burned for 3 days, and the oceans had turned to steam, and the atmosphere had been stripped away, and the surface had been reduced to molten glass, and when the great powers finally departed, they left behind a dead world and a warning to any other young species that might dream of defiance. But that was not the end of the story. Valith found the classified reports that described what happened next, and she learned that not all humans had died on Earth, and some had escaped in ships that fled toward the dead corridor, and the great powers had laughed at this desperate flight because nothing survived in the dead corridor, and the humans had simply chosen a slower death. The last transmissions from the fleeing human ships had been recorded and preserved, and Valeth played them back, and she heard voices filled with grief and rage, and something else that she could not identify at first. The humans had not begged, and they had not pleaded, and they had not asked for mercy. They had made a promise. The voice on the recording was calm and steady despite everything, and it spoke words that had been classified and hidden away and forgotten by everyone except the most paranoid intelligence officers. "We will survive," the voice said, "and we will grow strong, and we will remember what you have done, and we will return. And when we return, you will answer for the murder of our world and the death of our children and the crime of our extermination." The recording ended, and Valith sat in the dark vault, and she understood why this information had been hidden, and she understood why the great powers had wanted everyone to forget. They had been afraid even then, and they had hoped that the dead corridor would finish what they had started, and they had told themselves that the humans were dead, and they had repeated that lie until they believed it. 2,000 years had passed, and the humans had become a myth, and parents told their children stories about the proud species that had defied the galaxy and been destroyed for its arrogance, and the stories were meant to teach obedience and humility. Nobody had considered the possibility that the humans had survived. Valeth compiled her report, and she sent it to the Emperor, and she included all the details that had been hidden for so long, and she recommended that the Crimson Empire prepare for the worst, because if the humans had survived the dead corridor, then they had survived something that nothing else had ever survived. The Emperor read the report, and he called an emergency meeting of his council, and they debated what to do, and some argued for immediate attack, and some argued for diplomacy, and some argued for running away and hiding. Similar scenes played out in the Nova Dominion as their own archivists uncovered the same terrible history, and The leaders of both empires realized that they faced a threat unlike anything they had encountered in 300 years of Cold War. The humans had been weak once, and they had been destroyed for their weakness, and now they had returned, and nobody knew what they had become. Intelligence agencies across both empires worked frantically to gather information, and they analyzed the sensor data from the Endurance, and they tried to understand the technology that powered it, and they failed completely. The ship was impossible, and its drive system operated on principles that defied current physics, and its hull was made of materials that had never been seen before, and its weapon systems were completely unidentifiable. Some analysts theorized that the humans had discovered something in the dead corridor, and others suggested that they had developed entirely new sciences during their exile. And a few whispered that perhaps the humans had changed in more fundamental ways. The dead corridor was not just empty space after all, and it was a region of twisted physics and strange energies, and things that no other species had ever been able to study, because no other species had ever survived long enough to study them. What would 2,000 years in such a place do to a species, and what would it teach them? And what would it make them become? The Crimson Emperor stared at his tactical displays, and he watched the Endurance move steadily toward the galactic core, and he remembered the old stories he had been told as a child, and he remembered laughing at the foolish humans who had thought they could defy the great powers. He was not laughing now. The Nova Dominion mobilized its fleets, and the Crimson Empire did the same, and both powers told themselves that they were simply taking precautions, and both powers secretly prepared for war. But in the quiet hours of the night, the leaders of both empires asked themselves the same question, and they found no comfort in any answer they could imagine. The humans had promised to return, and they had kept their promise, and now the galaxy had to face the consequences of sins committed 2,000 years ago by ancestors who had thought themselves safe from retribution. The myth had become real, and the dead had returned, and terror spread through the stars like a plague without cure. High Archivist Vela sealed the vault and returned to her office, and she poured herself a drink with shaking hands, and she thought about the voice on that ancient recording. The humans had sounded so certain, and they had sounded so patient, and they had sounded like a species that had all the time in the universe now. She understood why they had waited 2,000 years, and they could wait a little longer if they needed to, and patience like that was more frightening than any weapon. The galaxy watched and waited, and the Endurance continued its journey, and somewhere in the darkness of space, a reckoning approached that had been 2,000 years in the making. Admiral Vorath of the Crimson Empire stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the human vessel on the main display, and he had been given a simple mission, and he was to make contact with the humans and determine their intentions. He had brought 12 warships with him because he was not a fool, and each ship was a kilometer long and bristled with weapons that could crack moons and shatter planets, and the formation was designed to intimidate and to remind the humans that the Crimson Empire was still mighty. The Endurance looked small against the backdrop of stars, and it moved through space with that strange grace that made Vorath uncomfortable, and it showed no sign of slowing down or changing course. Everett had read the old files, and he knew what his ancestors had done, and he told himself that he was not afraid of a single ship crewed by the descendants of a dead civilization. He opened a communication channel, and he broadcast a message in every language to translation. "Systems could manage, unknown vessel," he said. "This is Admiral Vorath of the Crimson Imperial Fleet, and you have entered sovereign space, and you are ordered to halt and identify yourself and state your intentions." Silence answered him. He repeated the message, and he waited, and he felt sweat forming on his brow. Despite the cool air of the bridge, the Endurance did not slow down, and it did not respond, and it simply continued on its course, as if the 12 warships surrounding it were nothing more than insects. Vorath ordered his ships to move closer, and they tightened their formation around the human vessel, and their weapons powered up to full readiness and targeting. Systems locked onto the small ship, human vessel, Vorath broadcast. Again, you will respond to this hail or you will be fired upon, and this is your final warning. The communication system crackled, and a voice came through, and it was speaking the common galactic tongue, and it was perfectly clear. Admiral Vorath. The voice said, "Your transmission has been received, and we thank you for your patience while we prepared our response." The main display shifted and a face appeared, and Vorath found himself looking at a human for the first time in his life. She was a woman with dark hair streaked with gray, and her eyes were calm and steady, and her face bore the patient expression of someone who had waited a very long time for something important. "I am Admiral Chun of the Human Compact Vessel Endurance," she said, "and I apologize for the delay in responding, but we wanted to make sure our translation systems were properly calibrated." Vorath stared at her, and he tried to reconcile this calm figure with the terrifying myths and the ancient reports, and the fear that had gripped the Empire since the ship first appeared. "Admiral Chun," he said, "you have entered Crimson Imperial space without authorization, and you are ordered to halt your vessel and submit to inspection." Chun smiled, and it was not a mocking smile or a cruel smile, but rather the smile of someone who found genuine amusement in a situation. "Admiral Vorath," she said, "I have a question for you before we proceed with formal negotiations. I hope you will indulge my curiosity." Vorath nodded because he did not know what else to do. "Does the Crimson Empire still exist?" Chun asked. "I mean, as a political entity, and do you still control the same territory you controlled 2,000 years ago?" The question confused Vorath, and he did not understand why she was asking something with such an obvious answer. "Of course the Crimson Empire still exists," he said. "We are one of the two great powers of the galaxy, and we have been for over 1,000 years." Chun nodded slowly, and her expression shifted to something that Vorath could not quite read. "Interesting," she said. "We had expected otherwise, and we had thought that the passage of time might have changed things. More significantly," she paused, and she seemed to be considering her next words carefully, "the human compact has returned to civilized space after a long absence," she said, "and we have many things to discuss with the Crimson Empire and the Nova Dominion and all the other species who participated in the events of 2,000 years ago." Vorath felt a chill run down his spine at her words, and the way she said them made him think of judges and courtrooms and sentences passed down for terrible crimes. "What do you want?" he asked, and his voice was not as steady as he would have liked. "We want many things, Admiral Vorath," Chun said, "but for the moment we want only to continue our journey to the galactic core, and we want to meet with representatives of your government, and we want to discuss the matter of reparations." The word hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. "Reparations," Vorath repeated. "Yes," Chun said, "for the destruction of our homeworld and the murder of 9 billion people and the attempted extermination of our entire species, and all the other crimes committed against humanity during what you called the Great Cleansing." Her voice remained calm throughout, and that calmness was more frightening than any display of rage could have been. Vorath tried to respond, and he found that his mouth had gone dry, and he took a moment to compose himself before speaking again. "The events you speak of happened 2,000 years ago," he said, "and the people responsible are long dead, and the current empire cannot be held accountable for the actions of ancestors we never knew." Chun tilted her head slightly, and she considered his words, and her expression did not change. "That is certainly one perspective," she said, "and it is a perspective we anticipated, and we are prepared to discuss the matter in detail with your leaders." She leaned forward slightly, and her eyes seemed to look directly into his soul. "But I would remind you, Admiral Vorath, that the people who died on Earth are also long dead, and their children are long dead, and their children's children are long dead, and we have spent 2,000 years carrying their memory, and we have not forgotten a single name." The transmission paused, and Chun seemed to be checking something off screen. "We do not seek vengeance, Admiral Vorath," she said, "but we do seek justice, and there is a difference, and we hope that the Crimson Empire will understand that difference." Vorath realized that his hands were shaking, and he gripped the railing in front of him to steady himself. "What happens if we refuse to discuss reparations?" he asked Chun. Smiled again, and this time the smile did not reach her eyes. "That would be unfortunate," she said, "and we would prefer to avoid unfortunate outcomes." She straightened in her chair and her tone became more formal. "The Endurance will continue on its present course, and we will arrive at the galactic core in approximately 17 days, and we expect to be met by diplomatic representatives from both the Crimson Empire and the Nova Dominion, and we expect those representatives to have the authority to negotiate on behalf of their governments." "And if we try to stop you?" Vorath asked. Chun looked at him for a long moment, and her expression was unreadable. "Admiral Vorath," she said, "you have 12 ships, and they are very impressive ships, and I am sure that they have won many battles against worthy opponents." She paused. "But you do not want to fight us, and I say this not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact. And I say it because I would prefer not to demonstrate why you do not want to fight us." The transmission ended and the display returned to showing the Endurance as it continued on its course, and it did not slow down and it did not speed up, and it simply moved forward as if the conversation had never happened. Edvard stood on his bridge, surrounded by 12 warships worth of firepower, and he had never felt so helpless in his entire career. He ordered his ships to fall back, and he sent a message to the Emperor, and he reported everything that had been said, and he recommended that diplomatic representatives be sent to meet the humans at the galactic core. He did not recommend attempting to stop the Endurance. He had looked into Admiral Chun's eyes, and he had seen something there that frightened him more than any weapon. He had seen patience. The kind of patience that came from waiting 2,000 years for a moment like this. The kind of patience that could wait a little longer, if it needed to. Grand Admiral Thyssen of the Nova Dominion was not impressed by the reports coming out of the Crimson Empire, and he believed that the Crimson cowards had simply lost their nerve in the face of an unknown threat. He had commanded the Nova fleets for 30 years, and he had won 17 major engagements, and he had never retreated from any enemy. And he was not about to start now. Nova Council had given him 47 warships, and they had ordered him to blockade the human vessel, and they had told him to demonstrate Nova superiority, and they had made it clear that this was an opportunity to humiliate their ancient rivals. Thyssen assembled his fleet in the Kara system, directly in the path of the Endurance, and he arranged his ships in a wall formation that stretched across the only viable approach vector, and he told himself that no single vessel could possibly break through such overwhelming force. The Endurance arrived on schedule, and it did not slow down when it detected the Nova fleet, and it simply continued on its course as if the 47 warships were not there. Thyssen opened a communication channel, and he did not bother with diplomatic niceties. "Human vessel," he announced, "I am Grand Admiral Thyssen of the Nova Dominion, and you will halt your engines and surrender your ship for inspection, or you will be destroyed." The response came quickly, and Admiral Chun's face appeared on his display, and she looked tired but not frightened. "Grand Admiral Thyssen," she said, "I had hoped that the Nova Dominion would be more reasonable than the Crimson Empire, but I see that hope was misplaced." Thyssen laughed at her, and he gestured at the tactical display showing his fleet. "You are one ship," he said, "and I have 47, and you will surrender or you will die, and those are your only options." Chun nodded slowly, and she seemed to be considering his words. "Grand Admiral," she said, "I am going to give you an opportunity that I did not give the Crimson Admiral, and I'm going to explain something to you because I believe you deserve to understand the situation before you make your decision." Thiessen leaned back in his command chair, and he crossed his arms, and he smiled with contempt. "Speak." Then, he said, "I enjoy hearing the desperate words of my enemies before I destroy them." Chun did not react to his insult, and she simply began to speak in that calm, measured tone that Thiessen was beginning to find irritating. 2,000 years ago, she said, our ancestors fled into the dead corridor because they had no other choice, and everyone assumed they would die there because everything dies in the dead corridor. She paused, and her eyes seemed to look past Thiessen into some distant memory. The dead corridor is not simply dangerous space, Grand Admiral. And it is not just radiation and gravity wells and spatial anomalies, and it is something much more fundamental and much more terrifying. Thiessen felt his smile falter slightly. But he did not interrupt. The dead corridor is a wound in reality itself. Chun continued, and it is a place where the laws of physics break down and reform in new configurations. And it is a place that kills everything that enters it because nothing can survive the constant flux of changing reality. She leaned forward, and her voice grew quieter but somehow more intense. "We survived it," she said. "And we did not just survive it, but we learned to thrive in it, and we adapted to its constant changes. And we discovered secrets that no other species has ever discovered, because no other species has ever had the opportunity to learn them." Thiessen forced himself to laugh again, but the sound was hollow. "Pretty words," he said, "but words do not stop. Plasma cannons and words do not break through shield barriers." Chun smiled, and the expression made Thiessen uncomfortable in ways he could not explain. "You are correct," she said, "and so I will offer a demonstration instead." The Endurance stopped moving, and for the first time since it had emerged from the dead corridor, it came to a complete halt. "Grand Admiral Thiessen," Chun said, "I am going to give you 3 hours to reconsider your position, and during those 3 hours, I want you to watch your sensor readings very carefully, and I want you to think about what you are seeing." She ended the transmission, and Thiessen stared at his display in confusion. Nothing happened. Endurance simply sat there motionless in space, and Thiessen's ships surrounded it completely, and their weapons were fully charged, and their crews were ready for battle. Thiessen waited, and he watched, and he wondered what game the humans were playing. 1 hour passed, and nothing changed. 2 hours passed, and Thiessen began to grow impatient, and he considered simply opening fire and ending this farce. Then his tactical officer made a sound of confusion, and Thiessen turned to look in his console. The officer was staring at his readings with wide eyes, and his fingers were moving frantically across his controls. "Grand Admiral," the officer said, "something is happening to our systems." Thiessen moved to the console, and he looked at the readings, and he did not understand what he was seeing. Power levels across the fleet were fluctuating wildly, and shield generators were cycling through frequencies at random, and weapon systems were reporting errors that made no sense. "What is causing this?" Thiessen demanded. "I do not know, sir," the officer said, "but it appears to be affecting every ship in the fleet simultaneously." Thiessen looked up at the main display, and the Endurance had not moved, and it had not fired any weapons, and it had not done anything visible at all. And yet something was reaching out from that small ship and touching every vessel in his fleet. The 3rd hour ended, and Admiral Chen's face appeared on his display again. But this time, it also appeared on every other display, on every other ship in the fleet at the same time. "Grand Admiral Thiessen," she said, "I trust you have had time to observe what is happening to your systems." Thiessen tried to respond, but his communication system was no longer under his control. "The dead corridor taught us many things," Chum continued, "and one of the things it taught us is that energy and matter and information are all fundamentally connected, and they can be manipulated if you understand the connections deeply enough." She spread her hands in a gesture that might have been apologetic. "Your ships are not damaged, Grand Admiral, and your crews are not harmed, and I want you to understand that what I'm about to do is not an act of war, but rather a demonstration of capability. Thiessen found his voice, and he shouted orders at his officers. And he demanded that they fire on the human vessel, and they tried to obey. Their weapons did not respond. "I'm going to disable your fleet now," Chun said. "And I'm going to do it without killing anyone, because I want you to deliver a message to the Nova Council." She paused, and her expression grew serious. "The message is this, and please convey it accurately. And we have not come back to destroy you, and we have come back to ensure that what happened to Earth never happens to anyone else. And we prefer to achieve this goal through diplomacy, but we are prepared to achieve it through other means if diplomacy fails." She raised her hand, and she made a small gesture, and every ship in Thiessen's fleet died, not destroyed, but simply dead. And their engines went silent, and their weapons went cold, and their shields collapsed, and their reactors dropped to emergency power, and every system that could be used to fight or flee simply stopped functioning. It happened in 17 seconds. Thiessen stood on his darkened bridge, surrounded by officers who were screaming in confusion and fear, and he stared at the Endurance as it began to move again. It passed through his fleet like water flowing around stones, and it did not pause, and it did not gloat, and it simply continued on its journey to the Galactic. Corps Admiral Chun's voice came through one final time on the emergency communication system. "You will have main power restored in approximately 6 hours," she said, "and your ships will be fully operational in 12 hours, and I recommend that you use that time to inform your government of what has happened here." The transmission ended. Thiessen sank into his command chair, and he stared at nothing, and he tried to understand what he had just witnessed. 47 ships and thousands of crew members and centuries of naval tradition, and all of it had been rendered meaningless in 17 seconds. The Endurance had not visibly fired a single shot, and now Thiessen had to explain to the Nova Council how he had lost a battle without a battle being fought. He thought about Admiral Chun's message, and he thought about the calm certainty in her voice, and he thought about what it meant for a species to spend 2,000 years in a place that should have killed them. He thought about patience, and he thought about power, and he thought about the difference between vengeance and justice. For the first time in his 30-year career, Grand Admiral Thiessen was afraid not of the humans as enemies, but of what they represented. Because if they could do this with one ship, then what could they do with a fleet? And more importantly, what would they do if diplomacy failed? Thiessen did not want to find out. News of the Nova fleet's defeat spread across the galaxy like fire on dry plains, and within hours, every inhabited world knew what had happened, and the story grew more terrifying with each retelling. The official reports were bad enough, and they described 47 warships disabled in seconds by a vessel that had not fired a single visible weapon, and they described systems failing and power dying and crews helpless in the dark. The unofficial reports were worse, and they spoke of strange energies and reality bending and technology so advanced that it seemed like magic to those who witnessed it. The Crimson Empire quietly withdrew all military vessels from the path of the Endurance, and they offered no explanation, and they made no announcements, but their actions spoke loudly enough. The Nova Dominion did the same, and Grand Admiral Thiessen had delivered his report in person to the council, and his hands had shaken as he spoke, and his voice had cracked when he described what he had seen. Both empires began emergency sessions, and their leaders gathered in secure chambers, and they debated what to do about a threat that none of them truly understood. In the Crimson Capital, the Emperor sat on his throne, and he listened to his advisors argue, and he felt the weight of 2,000 years of history pressing down upon his shoulders. One faction demanded immediate war, and they argued that the humans must be destroyed before they grew any stronger, and they pointed to the ancient records, and they said that their ancestors had the right idea, but simply failed to finish the job. Another faction called for surrender, and they argued that the Nova fleet's fate proved that military resistance was futile, and they said that it would be better to negotiate from a position of submission than to be destroyed resisting. A third faction suggested running, and they had already begun calculating routes to distant galaxies where the humans might never find them, and they argued that survival was more important than pride. The Emperor listened to all of them, and he felt contempt for each position in turn. He was old, and he had seen many crises in his long reign, and he had learned that the truth usually lay somewhere between the extremes. He raised his hand, and the chamber fell silent. "We do not know what the humans want," he said, "and we are making decisions based on fear rather than information, and this is foolish." He looked around the room at his advisors and generals and ministers. "The human admiral said they seek reparations," he continued, "and she said they did not seek vengeance, and perhaps she was lying, but perhaps she was telling the truth, and we will not know until we speak with them properly." He made his decision, and he announced that the Crimson Empire would send diplomatic representatives to meet the humans at the galactic core, and they would negotiate in good faith, and they would learn what justice meant to a species that had waited 2,000 years to claim it. Similar discussions took place in the Nova Dominion, and the Council eventually reached a similar conclusion, though it took them longer because they had to absorb the humiliation of their fleet's defeat. First, intelligence agencies across both empires continued their frantic work, and they analyzed every piece of data they could gather about the endurance, and they built models and ran simulations, and they tried to understand what they faced. The results were not encouraging. The drive system of the endurance appeared to manipulate space itself rather than simply moving through it, and this explained its strange grace and its impossible efficiency, and it meant that human ships could travel faster than anyone had thought possible. The hull was composed of materials that seemed to exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously, and this made it incredibly resistant to damage and virtually impossible to scan properly. The weapon systems remained a mystery because the humans had never actually fired them, and the disabling of the Nova fleet had been accomplished through means that the analysts could not even begin to explain. Some theorists proposed that the humans had learned to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality, and others suggested that they had discovered how to interface directly with the quantum substrate of the universe, and a few whispered that perhaps the humans had become something more than human during their long exile. The Dead Corridor continued to loom in everyone's thoughts, and it was a place that had killed everything that entered it for 10,000 years, and the humans had not only survived there, but had apparently mastered its secrets. What else had they discovered in that impossible place, and what other capabilities did they possess that they had not yet revealed? The Endurance was just one ship, and had disabled 47 warships without visible effort, and the question that haunted every leader in both empires was brutally simple. How many more ships were waiting in the Dead Corridor? Nobody knew, and nobody wanted to find out the hard way. On worlds throughout both empires, ordinary citizens watched the news feeds, and they talked about the humans, and they wondered what would happen next. Some were afraid, and they remembered the old stories about the species that had defied the great powers and been destroyed for its arrogance, and they wondered if the humans had come back for revenge. Others were curious, and they had never believed the official histories, and they wondered what the humans were really like and what their civilization had become during 2,000 years of exile. A few were ashamed, and they had read the true accounts of the Great Cleansing, and they knew that their ancestors had committed genocide against a young species that had done nothing wrong except refuse to kneel. The Endurance continued its journey toward the galactic core, and it passed through system after system, and it stopped for nothing and no one, and it moved with the steady inevitability of a force of nature. Admiral Chun did not make any more broadcasts, and she did not respond to the many attempts at communication that both empires made, and she simply continued forward toward her destination. The waiting was almost worse than the fear. Everyone knew that a reckoning was coming, and everyone knew that the sins of the past would finally be answered, and nobody knew what form that answer would take. Would the humans demand blood, and would they seek to repay the genocide of Earth with genocide of their own, and would they burn worlds as their world had been burned? Or would they truly seek justice as Admiral Chun had claimed, and would they accept reparations and apologies, and would they find a way to move forward that did not require more death? The leaders of both empires prepared for the diplomatic summit, and they gathered their best negotiators and their most experienced diplomats, and they tried to anticipate what the humans would demand. But in the quiet hours of the night, they also prepared for war, and they mobilized reserves, and they armed civilian vessels, and they made plans for desperate last stands, because they did not know what the humans wanted, and they did not know what the humans had become, and they did not know if mercy was something that had survived 2,000 years in the dead corridor. The galaxy held its breath and waited for the endurance to arrive at the core, and waited for the reckoning that had been delayed for 2,000 years but never forgotten. The humans were coming, and they remembered everything, and soon everyone would learn what that memory meant. The diplomatic summit was held on Station Eternal, and it was an ancient facility that floated in the space between the two empires, and it had been the site of every major negotiation for the last 500 years. The station had been designed to impress and intimidate, and its corridors were lined with the trophies of 100 conquered worlds, and its chambers were built on a scale that dwarfed most species, and everything about it spoke of power and permanence. Representatives from both empires arrived with full delegations, and the Crimson Emperor sent his finest negotiators and most decorated admirals and his most cunning politicians, and the Nova Council sent an equally impressive group. They filled the main chamber with their advisors and bodyguards and support staff, and they arranged themselves according to ancient protocols, and they prepared to negotiate from positions of strength. Then Admiral Chan arrived, and she walked into the chamber alone. She wore a simple uniform with no decorations except a small patch on her shoulder that showed a blue and green circle, and she carried nothing except a single data crystal, and she looked at the assembled might of two galactic empires as if they were children at a school meeting. The chamber fell silent as she walked to the center of the room, and she placed the data crystal on the negotiating table, and she looked around at the hundreds of faces watching her. "Thank you for meeting with us," she said, and her voice was calm and clear, and it carried to every corner of the vast chamber. She did not apologize for coming alone, and she did not explain why she had no delegation, and she simply began to speak. 2,000 years ago, 17 species participated in the destruction of Earth and the attempted extermination of humanity, and the records we have recovered list the names of every fleet commander and every ship captain and every government official who ordered or approved or participated in the Great Cleansing. She paused, and she let the silence stretch. "We have also identified the successor states of those 17 species, and we have traced the lines of political and legal continuity, and we know exactly who bears responsibility for the crimes committed against our people." The Crimson Ambassador rose from his seat, and his voice was sharp with indignation. "You speak of crimes," he said, "but you ignore context, and the humans of 2,000 years ago were arrogant and aggressive, and they refused to accept the established order, and they brought destruction upon themselves through their own stubbornness." Chun looked at him, and her expression did not change. "Ambassador," she said, "I have read the records of First Contact, and I have read the transcripts of every communication between humanity and the galactic powers, and I have read the ultimatums that were delivered, and I have read our ancestors' responses." She took a step toward him, and her voice grew quieter, but somehow more intense. "Our ancestors were a young species," she said, "and they had just discovered that they were not alone in the universe, and they were full of hope and curiosity, and they wanted nothing more than to join the galactic community as equals." She paused. "They were told that they could not be equals, and they were told that they must kneel or burn, and when they refused to kneel, they were burned. The ambassador tried to respond, but Chun raised her hand. I am not interested in debating the morality of what happened, she said, and I am not here to relitigate ancient history, and I am here to present the terms of reparation that the human compact requires before we can establish normal relations with the galactic community. She gestured to the data crystal. The terms are contained in this crystal, and I will summarize them for you now. She began to speak, and the chamber listened in growing disbelief. First, she said, we require a complete accounting of every species and every government and every individual who participated in the Great Cleansing, and this includes access to all historical archives and all classified records related to the attack on Earth and the subsequent hunt for human survivors. Second, we require formal acknowledgement of the genocide committed against humanity, and this acknowledgement must be made publicly by every successor state of every species that participated in the Great Cleansing. Third, we require the establishment of human sovereignty over the Dead Corridor and 17 additional star systems to serve as the foundation of our renewed civilization. Fourth, we require the establishment of a galactic court to ensure that genocide can never again be committed against any species, and this court will have the authority to intervene in the affairs of any government that threatens to commit such crimes. She paused, and she looked around the chamber. These are our terms, and they are not negotiable. The Nova representative rose, and his voice shook with barely controlled anger. These terms are impossible, he said, and they would destabilize the entire galactic order, and they would strip both empires of territory and sovereignty, and they would establish humanity as judges over all other species. Chun nodded slowly. Yes, she said. They would do all of those things? Then why should we agree to them? The representative demanded. Chun smiled, and it was the same patient smile that she had shown Admiral Varath and Grand Admiral Thiessen. Because the alternative is worse, she said. The representative laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. You are one ship, he said, and even with your strange technology, you cannot threaten two empires with one ship. Chun did not respond immediately, and she seemed to be considering how to answer. Ambassador, she finally said, do you understand why we sent only one ship? The representative shook his head. It was not because we are weak, Chun said, and it was not because we lack numbers. She paused. It was because we wanted to give you a choice, and we wanted to demonstrate our capabilities without overwhelming you, and we wanted you to have the opportunity to choose justice freely, rather than having it forced upon you. She looked around the chamber, and her eyes seemed to see something far away. We have spent 2,000 years in the Dead Corridor, and we have built a civilization there that you cannot imagine, and we have ships numbered in the thousands, and we have technologies that make the Endurance seem primitive by comparison. Her voice grew softer but somehow more powerful. We could have come with a fleet that darkened the stars, and we could have demanded unconditional surrender, and we could have burned your worlds as you burned ours. She shook her head. But we did not do those things because we do not want revenge, and we want justice, and there is a difference. She placed her hand on the data crystal. These terms are designed to ensure that what happened to Earth never happens again, and they are designed to create a galaxy where no species has to fear genocide, and they are designed to build a future that is better than the past. She looked directly at the assembled representatives. You have a choice, and you can accept these terms and work with us to build that future, or you can reject them and face the consequences. The chamber was silent, and nobody seemed willing to speak. Finally, the Crimson Ambassador asked the question that everyone was thinking. What consequences? Chum sighed, and she suddenly looked very tired. If you reject these terms, she said, then we will assume that you are not interested in justice, and we will assume that you would commit genocide again, if given the opportunity, and we will act accordingly. She did not elaborate, and she did not need to. The representatives looked at each other, and they looked at the data crystal, and they thought about the Nova fleet disabled in 17 seconds, and they thought about what a species that had survived the dead corridor might be capable of. They thought about the choice they faced, and they realized that it was not much of a choice at all except justice or face a reckoning. The negotiations began, and they would last for many days, but everyone in the chamber already knew how they would end. The humans had waited 2,000 years for this moment, and they had not come all this way to be turned away. The terms would be accepted because the alternative was unthinkable, and perhaps that was the point. The negotiations continued on Station Eternal, but in the shadows of both empires, a different kind of planning was taking place. Hardliners had not accepted defeat, and they had not accepted the humiliation of bowing to a species that should have been extinct, and they had begun secret communications across enemy lines for the first time in 300 years. Admiral Korath of the Crimson Empire met with Fleet Commander Thiessen of the Nova Dominion in a hidden outpost far from any inhabited world, and they shared their fears and their anger and their desperate plans. "We cannot allow this," Korath said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Our ancestors destroyed the humans for a reason, and if we accept their terms, we will be admitting that our entire civilization was built on a crime." Thiessen nodded, and his humiliation at the hands of the Endurance still burned in his chest. "The humans have one ship," he said. "And yes, that ship has capabilities we do not understand. But it is still one ship, and we have thousands." Korath leaned forward, and his eyes gleamed with desperate hope. "If we combine our fleets," he said, "if we put aside our differences and strike together, we can overwhelm them with sheer numbers, and even their strange technology cannot defeat us if we bring enough force to bear." The two admirals made their plans, and they reached out to their allies and supporters in both empires, and they assembled a coalition of those who would rather fight than surrender. The conspiracy grew, and soon nearly 3,000 warships had been committed to the plan, and their crews were told that they would be defending their civilization against an existential threat, and most of them believed it. The Endurance was tracked to a remote system where it had paused to conduct some unknown business, and the combined fleet jumped in with overwhelming force, and they surrounded the human vessel with a wall of weapons that stretched across the entire system. Korath felt triumph surge through him as he looked at the tactical display, and the Endurance looked tiny and alone against the mass of Imperial might. He opened a communication channel, and Admiral Chun's face appeared on his screen. "Admiral Chun," he said, "you are surrounded by the combined military forces of the Crimson Empire and the Nova Dominion, and your terms are rejected, and you will surrender your vessel immediately, or you will be destroyed." Chun looked at him, and her expression was not afraid or angry, but rather sad. "Admiral Korath," she said, "I recognize your name from the files, and your ancestor was one of the fleet commanders who participated in the attack on Earth." Korath felt a flash of pride at her words. "My family has defended the Empire for generations," he said, "and we will not allow you to destroy what they built." Chen nodded slowly, and she seemed to be gathering her thoughts. "We hoped you would not do this," she said. "We hoped that you had changed, and we hoped that 2,000 years would have taught your species the value of peace." She shook her head. "But I suppose some lessons must be demonstrated rather than taught." Korath laughed, and he gestured at his display. "You demonstrated your technology against 47 ships," he said, "but you cannot disable 3,000, and you cannot fight an entire galaxy with one vessel." "No," Chun agreed, "I cannot." She paused, and something shifted in her expression. "That is why I did not come alone." Korath felt the first stirring of unease, and he looked at his tactical display, but it showed nothing except his own fleet and the single human ship. "You are bluffing," he said. Chun smiled, and it was the saddest smile Korath had ever seen. "Admiral," she said, "did you truly believe that we would send one ship to reclaim justice for 9 billion dead? And did You truly believe that we had spent 2,000 years preparing and would risk everything on a single vessel? She raised her hand. The dead corridor taught us many things, she said. And one of the things it taught us is patience, and another thing it taught us is how to hide. She made a small gesture, and the dark mist between the stars began to change. Ships emerged from nothing, and they appeared by the hundreds and then by the thousands, and they materialized out of empty space as if they'd always been there. But simply invisible Korath stared at his display as the numbers climbed, and his blood ran cold in his veins. 1,000 human ships, 2,000 human ships, 3,000 human ships, and still they came 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, and the emergence finally slowed and stopped, and the combined Imperial fleet was surrounded by a force that matched them ship for ship. The human vessels were not hidden behind stealth fields or cloaking devices, and they had simply been there the entire time, existing in a state that sensors could not detect, and now they had chosen to be seen. Admiral Chun's voice came through the silence. "We did not want to do this," she said. "We wanted to give you a chance to choose justice freely, and we wanted to believe that you could change." She paused and her voice grew heavy with sorrow. "But you made your choice, and now I must make mine." Korath felt panic rising in his chest, and he shouted orders at his fleet, and weapons powered up across 3,000 ships. "Admiral Korath," Chun said, "your weapons are still functional, and your shields are still active, and your engines are still online." She leaned forward, and her eyes seemed to burn with an ancient grief. "We are not going to disable your fleet this time, and we are not going to demonstrate our capability, and we are not going to give you another chance." She spread her hands. "We are simply going to surround you, and we are going to wait, and we are going to see what you choose to do next." Korath looked at his tactical display, and he saw the human fleet perfectly positioned around his own, and he saw that for every gun he could bring to bear, there was a human gun pointed back. He thought about firing first, and he thought about going down fighting, and he thought about the glory of dying in battle against impossible odds. Then he thought about his crew, and he thought about the families waiting at home, and he thought about what would happen to both empires if this battle was fought. He thought about Admiral Chun's words about justice and vengeance and the difference between them, and for the first time he truly understood what she had meant. The humans could have destroyed the Imperial fleet in seconds, just as they had disabled the Nova fleet, and they could have ended the battle before it began, and they could have proven their superiority through force. Instead, they had chosen to give him one final chance to stand down. They had chosen mercy, even when he had chosen violence. Korath looked at the human ships surrounding his fleet, and he felt something break inside him. He had been prepared to die, and he had been prepared to fight, and he had been prepared to destroy. He had not been prepared for forgiveness. The communication channel crackled, and Admiral Chun spoke one final time. "We are not here to destroy you," she said. "We are here to ensure you never destroy anyone else and stand down, and this is your last chance to choose peace." Korath closed his eyes, and he thought about his ancestors and their choices and the world they had burned. He thought about his own choices and the future he could help build or destroy. He gave the order to stand down one by one across 3,000 ships. Weapons powered off and shields lowered, and engines went silent. Combined fleet surrendered without a shot being fired, and in the darkness between the stars, 6,000 human ships waited and watched and hoped that this time peace would last. The surrender of the combined fleet broke the last resistance in both empires, and the hardliners who had organized the ambush were arrested by their own governments, and the negotiations on Station Eternal resumed with a new sense of urgency. The terms were accepted within a week. The Crimson Empire and the Nova Dominion formally acknowledged the genocide of humanity, and they opened their archives, and they revealed the full horror of what had been done 2,000 years ago. The records showed more than anyone had known, and they showed secret experiments and hunting parties and bounties. paid for human survivors, and they showed a systematic effort to erase not just humanity, but all memory of humanity from the universe. The public reaction was profound, and citizens across both empires read the records and watched the reconstructed footage and learned for the first time the true nature of the crime their ancestors had committed. Some rejected the truth, and they clung to the old stories about human arrogance and justified destruction, but they were a minority, and their voices grew quieter as the evidence mounted. Most people accepted the truth, and they felt shame, and they wondered how they could make amends for something so terrible. The Human Compact accepted sovereignty over the Dead Corridor and 17 additional star systems, and they began the long process of building permanent settlements outside the impossible space that had been their home for 2 millennia. Human ships traveled freely through the galaxy, and they were greeted with curiosity and fear, and sometimes with genuine welcome by species who had never participated in the Great Cleansing and had no reason to feel guilty. The Galactic Court was established, with representatives from every major species, including humanity, and it was given the authority to investigate and prevent genocide and to intervene in conflicts that threatened to escalate to extinction-level violence. Admiral Chun was invited to address the first session of the court, and she stood before representatives of 100 species, and she spoke about what the humans had learned during their long exile. The Dead Corridor is a harsh teacher, she said, and it does not care about politics or history or grievances, and it only cares about survival. She paused, and she looked around the chamber at the faces watching her. We went into that place as refugees fleeing destruction, and we emerged as something different, and we emerged as a species that had learned to survive anything, because we had already survived the worst thing we could imagine. She smiled, and it was a genuine smile without the sadness that had marked her earlier expressions. But survival alone is not enough. And that was the most important lesson the corridor taught us, and we could have become monsters in that place, and we could have let our grief and our rage consume us, and we could have emerged seeking only revenge. She shook her head. Instead, we chose to become guardians, and we chose to use our strength to protect rather than destroy, and we chose to build a civilization based on the principle that no species should ever face extinction at the hands of another. She gestured to the assembled representatives. This court represents the fulfillment of that principle, and it represents a promise that the galaxy will never again allow genocide to go unpunished, and it represents hope for a future where young species can reach for the stars without fear of being destroyed for their ambition. The chamber erupted in applause, and Admiral Chum stood quietly and accepted the recognition with grace. In the months that followed, the galaxy transformed in ways that nobody had predicted. Human technology began to spread, and the secrets of the Dead Corridor were shared freely, and diseases that had plagued other species for millennia were cured overnight, and travel times between distant systems dropped from weeks to hours. The humans did not conquer, and they did not demand tribute, and they did not establish an empire of their own. Instead, they integrated into the galactic community as partners and teachers, and they shared their knowledge without reservation, and they helped rebuild worlds that had been damaged by centuries of Cold War between the empires. The Crimson Empire and the Nova Dominion found their ancient rivalry fading, and the humans served as mediators and bridges, and their presence forced both powers to reconsider their assumptions about each other. Trade flourished and cultural exchange expanded, and species that had been enemies for generations began to discover common ground. It was not a perfect transformation, and there were setbacks and conflicts and moments when the old hatreds threatened to resurface, but the Human Compact was always there to remind everyone of what happened when civilizations chose destruction over cooperation. Admiral Chun retired from active service after 5 years, and she returned to the Dead Corridor to live out her remaining years in the strange, beautiful place that had been home to her people for so long before. She left. She gave one final public address, and it was broadcast to every inhabited world in the galaxy. 2,000 years ago, she said, your ancestors taught us that the universe was cruel, and they taught us that power was everything, and they taught us that the weak existed only to serve the strong. She paused, and her eyes seemed to look across the vast distances of space to something only she could see. We went into the dark, and we learned to be stronger than cruelty. And we learned that true power comes from the choice not to use it. And we learned that the weak are not resources to be exploited, but potential to be nurtured. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had completed a long journey and found peace at the end. Now we have returned to teach you something different, and we have returned to teach you that strength can choose mercy, and we chose mercy, and we hope you will not make us regret that choice. She raised her hand in farewell. The stars belong to all of us, and let us explore them together. The transmission ended, and Admiral Chung returned to the corridor, and the galaxy continued to change and grow and heal. The humans had returned, and they had brought justice instead of vengeance, and they had offered mercy instead of destruction, and in doing so, they had proven that the universe did not have to be cruel. It could be kind if enough people chose kindness. It could be just if enough people chose justice. It could be hopeful if enough people chose hope. The humans had made their choice 2,000 years ago when they fled into the impossible darkness, rather than surrender their principles. Now the galaxy was making its choice as well. For the first time in a very long time, the future looked bright.